Arts Policy and Accountability Committee. My name's Rory Vaughan, Councillor Rory Vaughan. I'm the chair of the committee. Just to remind participants of a few housekeeping points, please keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking, and please wait until I call you before speaking. So thank you for that. Item 1 is apologies for absence, and apologies for absence have been received from Councillor Lisa Homan. Are there any other apologies for absence? I'll take it that there are none. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest, please? Okay, thank you. I take it that there are none there. Item 3 is minutes of the previous meeting. Are the, clearly subject to any comments people have, are the minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of April 2021 agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, agreed by me as well, I can say. So thank you for that. So those are agreed. Item 4 was general public questions, but none have been received. So we can move straight on to item 5, which is the update on the current and future provision of support for local businesses during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. So just to give a précis, the report provides an update on the range of activity that the Council's business and enterprise team has undertaken to assist local businesses through further COVID-19 restrictions since the last update to our committee in November 2020. It also outlines the scope of planned business support initiatives until the end of March 2022. So first of all, can I remind officers, just by way of housekeeping, to introduce themselves when they first address the committee. So just by way of introduction. So first of all, could I ask Karen Gailey, who's Assistant Director for the Economy, Nikki Burgess, Business and Enterprise Manager, and Sam Ridley, Economic Development Officer, High Streets and Markets, to introduce this item. And then we'll come on to Councillors Jones, Councillor Andrew Jones and Councillor Guy Vincent to say a few words. We've also got some representatives from various business networks who I'm very pleased to say have been able to join us tonight, and perhaps I'll introduce them at a later stage. But we've got Patricia Bench again from Hammersmith. Thank you, Patricia, for joining, and Paul Kelly from I Can Help Your Business, who works in partnership with the council. Unfortunately, Sarah King from the Federation of Small Businesses, who joined us in November, is unable to attend tonight, but will send a written update. As I said, apologies, but we'll send a written update that will be circulated to committee members after the meeting. So please can you introduce yourselves in turn and provide us with your feedback about your experiences. So starting, I think, with Karen Gailey, Nikki Burgess and Sam Ridley to introduce them. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, committee. I'm Karen Gailey. I'm the Assistant Director for the Economy. I was just going to give a very short introduction to the report. So since we were here in November of last year, there have been further lockdowns, as you all will be aware, but also a gradual easing since April. Having said that, we're not without our challenges, since November and also in the current time. You'll see from the report that obviously some sectors have been more adversely affected than others. And because we've got a high proportion of arts, entertainment and hospitality businesses in the borough, along with retail and wholesale sector, we've tried to make our support targeted to help those that need it the most and retain the health of our economy. Of course, the future is still quite uncertain, but one of the things we've been guided by has been our industrial strategy, and that's to ensure that we're supporting innovation, we're supporting entrepreneurship, inclusive growth, and to support all of this, a strong arts and culture sector thriving alongside. I'll just say briefly, the main thrust of our activity since November has been the distribution of the additional restrictions grant. So as further lockdowns were announced and lifted, there were different amounts of money given to councils to distribute as quickly as possible to businesses. And my service, led by Nikki, who's here on the call today, and Sam, have been very focused on getting this money. So in all, since November, we've had 5.3 million to distribute. And again, we've tried to prioritise those sectors where businesses have needed the support the most. So again, retail and hospitality, home-based micro businesses, businesses outside the business rates system. Because alongside this, we've been working very closely with our business rates team, who have distributed nearly £100 million in grants to a huge amount of businesses across the borough. We've also focused on growth sector businesses as well, because obviously supporting those businesses that have the capacity to grow has been key to our industrial strategy. And we've also tried to help self-employed people. And then alongside that, we've continued to run schemes like Our Space is Your Space, helping businesses to use outdoor space when they haven't been able to trade indoors. We've had high street ambassadors. We've continued, and we will continue with the local shop safe programme. We've really tried to focus on broadband improvement. We've accessed whatever government funding has been out there. So, for example, the Cultural Recovery Fund has supported some of our theatres and cultural industries. We've done some programmes like helping older people to start up businesses that have been hugely popular, and we will run more of those sessions. We've offered digital skills, and again, they've been massively popular and oversubscribed. And we've continued to run our enterprise club. We continue to look for affordable workspace for our businesses. And of course, behind all of this has been the business network, chaired by Councillor Vincent. At the beginning of the pandemic, was meeting on a weekly basis, and now is meeting on a monthly basis, and is becoming more strategic and looking to the longer term as we head for recovery. So I'll just touch on the future recovery as we are planning it, because we are one of the boroughs that successfully spent all the government additional restrictions grant money. So we have now been allocated a further £2.2 million to support recovery and to support businesses getting back on their feet. And we have put together a package of programmes so that we can focus the recovery again where it's needed. We want to continue to give out grants because we think some businesses are going to desperately need an injection of cash. So we're talking about having a recovery fund, but we also want to make sure that we are well positioned to support the recovery of the high street and our town centres. And, one of the things we've discussed with Councillor Jones and Councillor Vincent is a high street recovery plan for each of our main high streets. And to support this, we will need, we'll need credible data, which we can get from the GLA. We're looking at an e-commerce platform. We're looking at more digital training packages because that's what has been in demand from our businesses. We're looking at more public realm improvements, and we're looking at what we can do to use that money to properly invest back in the high street. And there are some other suggestions in there as well. I'm happy to discuss those as we go through the evening. But I'll hand over now so that we can hear some of the voices.
Thank you very much, Karen. I don't know whether other members of your team wanted to comment further, or whether it's time for Councillor Jones to say something. Andrew Jones, would you like to comment?
Yes, I mean, briefly, Karen's given an excellent summary and overview of the many strands of activity. But I mean, there's a few things I want to say since I last spoke at this Policy and Accountability Committee. And the first thing is to say a huge thanks to Karen and her team, and to Councillor Guy Vincent with the business network, and Officer Sam involved in that, and Nikki, because the last 18 months, as I hardly need to say, has been probably one of the most challenging for many people in their careers and their working lives. and for many of our businesses. And I do think that the Hammersmith and Fulham Council officers and colleagues have really risen to the challenge. It has been very difficult, as you heard from Karen, for many businesses, and it's also been difficult for officers supporting that. We have been very effective at distributing money from the government, which I know has been a challenge in some parts of the country. And as Karen said, we've been allocated more, we've been effective at gaining more of that money. And that has been a large part of the earlier story in the initial shock of lockdown and of COVID. I think now the question is many of those things that Karen was talking about building back better out of the recovery. And we're intent on that through our industrial strategy, which really, I think, has slightly evolved, obviously to reflect the post-pandemic, hopefully post-pandemic context as we emerge. The other thing I would say is that, it's been a very uneven impact on different industries and businesses. And as Karen said, a huge impact on the arts, on cultural industries and hospitality. And we're very much aware of that. And I think, in terms of the recovery fund, this is not something that is suddenly quickly going to subside. And we're intent on building back the vibrant and lively arts scene and indeed all of the hospitality industry that's in Hammersmith and Fulham. And that's a really important part of our placemaking around the industrial strategy, around the White City Innovation District, but around the town centres in Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith and Fulham Broadway. So, it's not, I suppose, to quote the old maxim, over yet, but I think we have effectively risen to the challenge thus far. And I think we have quite a coherent plan for supporting businesses in different industries to emerge from the pandemic stronger. And part of that is the digital investment and the money we're trying to support businesses in that digital shift that you heard Karen talk about. The final thing, I think, is also there is opportunity for Hammersmith and Fulham. We have one of the highest proportions of people who've moved into what I think is now being generally described as hybrid working, from the home working through the pandemic. We have a large number of people, as I've said before, this is potentially very good news for our high streets, for local businesses, and for a different economy that emerges after the pandemic. Anyway, there are many other colleagues to talk, and I particularly think I should pass on to others to say who've been, particularly Guy, perhaps, would you say something about the business network? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Jones. Councillor Vincent, did you want to chip in at this?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for inviting us, Chair of the committee. Nice to see you all. A couple of points. The first thing, I'll start with a couple of gloomy things. Two gloomy things. One is we have had a number of pushback from people in relation to grants. And that is because the way it works tends to be that a cabinet minister stands up in Whitehall and announces that billions of pounds are about to be handed down to businesses. They then don't bother issuing any guidance or indeed the money for sometimes weeks, sometimes longer. And that means that we get immediate blowback as a local authority where people say, well, where's the money? And then we find that when the guidance arrives, we can't give it to all the business we'd like to give it to. So there are still, unfortunately, some businesses which have really not seen any grant money. There has been an enormous amount of work to do on this. And I think it's worth getting in the minutes that the business grants team, Jamie Mullins and his team, have been working enormously long hours to get all the money out. But that doesn't mean, obviously businesses are desperate and they've been pushing and pushing and complaining as the Treasury makes an announcement and then nothing turns up. So that has been a lot of pressure that people have been under, officers have been under. The second point I'd make is that it's far from over in terms of economic basis. And I think one thing that comes out of the business network, and I know Paul Kelly, who's here tonight, we've discussed this at the business network, is the fact that an awful lot of our smaller businesses have been burdened with debt, whether that is going to be the rent that they've had to roll up because landlords obviously are trying to get paid their rent. A lot of landlords rely upon it for their own survival. And also VAT, corporation tax, other debts that have been postponed and indeed loans that have been taken on. So I think we're going to be working terribly hard to support a lot more businesses. And that's one of the key things that the borough is doing, is giving advice, providing advice either directly or through various other business advice agencies. On the more positive side, there's lots of good things to talk about. I mean, Karen's mentioned it, and Karen and her team, Nikki and Sam, have done a great job, and all the others, and I pay tribute to them. There are great things to look forward to. I mean, the major streets, King Street, it firstly has an excellent bid, the Hammersmith bid, which is doing a lot of work to do it up, and it's going to be producing a lot of new things to make it actually more attractive, because of course we have the flyer in the middle of it, which is not the most attractive thing. We've got things to look forward to, IKEA and the town hall, which is going to put a lot more life into King Street. Similarly, we have a Fulham bid, which does wonderful work as well down in North End Road, and we have the market down there, which creates a completely unique approach. However, in addition, we have a lot of other smaller high streets, which again is something that on the business network we're very concerned about. But there's lots of good news there as well. We have representatives from many of the smaller business areas. So, for instance, Wandsworth Bridge Road. I've got a great bunch of very innovative people who've just succeeded in getting the seed money from the Mayor's award. If they've got £20,000 to build a project, and if they're successful, they can get up to another £200,000, and that's some very innovative work down on Wandsworth Bridge Road. And it's the sort of work we want to duplicate across the borough. So there's lots of good stories, and you know, I've enjoyed working with the business network. We're now relaunching it to get it into a much more strategic approach. But one of the good things about it, we are actually getting, you know, real life tales from people who are running businesses of all different sizes in the borough, and they are advising the council how they should be doing what they should be doing. I hope that's helpful. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Councillor Vincent. I think that certainly adds to what's been said already and gives us a good overview. I wonder now if I could invite the guests that we've got this evening. I think we've got Paul, Kelly and Patricia Bench, if they wanted to add anything to that before we go into some questions and discussion. Paul, would you like to, thank you for joining us tonight. I wonder if you wanted to sort of make any comments on how things have worked so far and what the future holds.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. First of all, I think as someone who has worked with many boroughs over the past few years, I think people need to be reminded that Hammersmith and Fulham is one of the more supportive boroughs of small businesses within Greater London. It's generally very proactive, and the work is done as a sort of a bottom line thing for small businesses and growing businesses and startups. You know, there's a range of about 10, 12 core things that it has consistently done over the past few years. The past year has been very, very difficult. 18 months has been very difficult for the smaller businesses, and as Councillor Vincent has said, there's a number of smaller businesses that have just missed out on all funds, primarily non-rate paying businesses, and they tend to fall into a group of businesses that have various names. They're basically disaffected group of people who've not had or been able to get their SEIS grants, so they've not been able to get funding being self-employed. They've not had business rates, and they've not going to get support there. But luckily, the council has supported a number of them with the ARG grant, so there has been some support. But one of the things I do for the council is I operate the Business Advice and Support Helpline, which is basically a phone number anyone in the borough can ring. Anybody based in the borough can ring or has a business in the borough and can ask questions about general business, not specifically about the council, but more about general business support. And the questions that did keep coming up in the core when the funds were being released, so in the core of the pandemic, was that not enough people knew about what was being done to support local businesses. Now, there is an awful lot of work that has been done by the economic development team, and this isn't exclusively an issue with Hammersmith and Fulham. Every borough has a problem reaching out to its community. Having contact with the community would always be a bonus, and I know with the plans that are going forward, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of plans in to reach more and more small businesses. I think there's a lot more that can be done, but sadly funding is very, very limited. But with the funding, I guess the council has been getting, looking through the list of all the projects that are planned, and having spoken to the economic development team about some of those projects as well, you know, I think that the council has got to be seen as one of the leading councils I'm going to say London. It may be possibly England or the UK. We're putting forward a wide range of support options for small businesses, starting businesses, and growing businesses within the borough, and also hopefully inviting and bringing more businesses into the borough.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's really helpful, and I'm glad to hear the sort of positive messages there about the way that the team's reacting has reacted, and also the sort of comparison with elsewhere in London and in the country. Patricia, did you want to come in at this point? I think you're still on mute, Patricia.
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, good. Sorry about that. The sun's in my eyes and I thought I'd done it. Yes, just really wanting to echo what Karen said earlier, that, you know, obviously we've been in lockdown and that's affected the town centre again, you know, not for the first time. And it's still affecting the number of office sectors that returning to work, as you can imagine. We're going to do, one of my colleagues is going to do a ring round of the serviced offices tomorrow to see if there's been any difference since this week, since the 19th lifting of restrictions. There does feel a few more people. I've been in the office today, and my team is back as well. So we're there. It's nearly full team every day now for us, more or less. And there does seem an uplift in the number of people there. But that's still one of our big challenges, both from the office and from the high street. What we're doing to try and encourage all of those things is, as the guy mentioned earlier, we've embarked on a public realm vision, which we're working very closely with various offices in the council, in planning and other departments, to try and deliver a more attractive place for people to return to, so that it feels like the town has moved on. The town centre has moved on. It's not just deteriorated or gone stale or any of those things. We feel it's very important to make sure that it feels like it's moving forward and it's energised. We've brought back our cultural programme, our summer cultural programme, which is going really well. We've put the screen outside 245 on Hammersmith Road there. For various reasons, we couldn't do it on Lewis Square this year, but we brought the big screen back, and Wimbledon was a big success there. And we had 100 or so people there for the men's final a couple of weeks ago. We've got a film night tomorrow night, which we've taken registration via the privilege card, which is like a benefit / discount card we've been running for years for the town centre, and we've made the film night as a special offer, a special benefit, especially towards the privilege card holders. And we had to stop the registration when it got to 180 because we have no more seats, and we don't want to sort of have a riot on our hands for the Greatest Showman. But what it does do is demonstrate the appetite for people to want to go somewhere where they feel safe, where they're nearly all local people, either people that are working locally, but mainly there's a lot of residents in that number. And it just demonstrates that the appetite for that type of thing, and we're just really we're really delighted with the response it's been getting. We're going to be showing the Olympics, the opening ceremonies on Friday afternoon, and then for the next 2 weeks the Olympics will be there, followed a couple of weeks after that by the Paralympics, and we're showing all that in partnership with 245. So we've got a big cultural programme that I can tell you more about that, but just to let you know that that's happening, and the response has been great. There's definitely an appetite there. On the public realm vision, we've been working closely with Roger Stirk Harbour, who are the architects doing quite a lot of developments in Hammersmith. So they're helping us try to create a more unified appearance and an upgraded appearance that links the town centre, the various segments of the town centre, just trying to make it more cohesive for people to navigate. Of course, our Shop Local, Shop Safe, that's been ongoing throughout the pandemic and still is. We did a special pub watch last week in preparation for the 19th, any extra advice, help and advice for the changes, just to reassure the businesses, you know, that of the help and advice that is out there. And you know, we continue to provide these forums for the knowledge and information that we can pass on and have guest speakers to pass on to our businesses. There's been a big uptake in cycling, as there has throughout London, I suppose. But so we're providing monthly doctor bikes at the moment, and the uptake of that is great. You know, people getting their bikes out of the shed, or there's some rather fancy ones as well that are being used, and both for commuters, people commuting in, but also you know, people coming in to shop and do their businesses locally in Hammersmith. And we see that very much as part of developing the 15-minute high street to try and make sure that people can come in easily and safely, and with different modes of transport. So there's been quite a lot of activity. The one, if I can say one negative, which is a bit heartbreaking, that just over a week ago we had floods in the centre of Hammersmith, and quite a number of businesses couldn't open on Tuesday. They have now all reopened, but there was some rather severe damage in places. A number of hospitality lost food stocks and things like that. The Dartmouth was one of those. Kindred in Bradmore Square, the whole of Bradmore Square was flooded. All the businesses there were closed until some managed to open the following late afternoon, but some were closed for a couple of days. So that was really, really disheartening after all the work and the wait for the 19th of July, and literally a week before. An act of God throws a giant bucket of water over us. So that was a bit tough to deal with, but we got through it. Kingsmill was quite badly affected, and had to have some lots of water pumped out, and some of the banks as well, who had been opened all throughout the pandemic, and some of them had to close that day. NatWest was closed, and Lloyd's was closed as well. But the resilience was great, and they opened, as I say, either the next day or the day after. So we didn't let that put us down either. So we're going to press on with these plans that we've got, and it's been great to work with Nikki and Sam and Guy to provide to help support the networks and other platforms that we've been working together on.
Okay, thank you very much, Patricia.
Thank you.
That's helped it, given us a great update on what's happening around the Hammersmith area. Obviously, clearly concerned to hear about the flooding last week. Obviously, we realised that lots of residents had similar problems, and hopefully we're not going to get quite as much rain tonight. Members of the committee, I just wondered if there are comments or questions that you had at this point. Councillor Orford.
Right. Yes. Well, it's didn't hear very much about this e-commerce platform. I wonder if somebody could give me a bit more information about it, how it was proposing to work, and also what would be the security if they're hoping for a virtual high street, how it was actually going to be administered and who was running it.
Nikki Burgess, I'm from the team. Hi. So the virtual high street is an e-commerce platform. We would be bringing in we will procure it and choose a supplier, and it will mean that as residents, you will be able to buy multiple products from multiple businesses. We'll have a hub located in the borough. So when people make their orders, they will be collected by Green Transport, taken to the hub, consolidated into packages and delivered to businesses on the same day. So if you like, it will be a local competitor for Amazon, where we encourage people to buy locally and keep money in the economy. There are several platforms that do this, and they have run very successfully, and we will be procuring that and then choose the one that we decide to go with.
And how will the local businesses become involved with the platform? How will you market it? And how will local residents know when going, if they, presumably this is all obviously online, so when they're wanting to buy, oh, I don't know, some white t-shirts, say, I'll just give that as an example, how will they know that it's local? How will they know it's secure? And well, how will they,
well, the
on a practical level?
Sorry.
No, please.
So the company that we buy, so the company that we use will be responsible and have already delivered platforms where people. There are several platforms where there are several platforms, e-commerce projects. So they will look after the safety and security of the people purchasing. But we will, as part of the project, be doing a huge marketing campaign to residents, which will include high street banners and information that will go out to residents. But we will also be doing a huge amount of work with businesses. And part of this project as well will involve the company that we bring in going into businesses and helping them choose and take photos of the products that they might want to sell online, and also help them. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. There will also be a website developed, so each business will have their own like virtual shop on the website, and we will be keen to get as many businesses involved as possible, otherwise it won't be successful.
Well, I don't wish to sound negative, and it seems an excellent, interesting idea. How will you prevent scamming? Because I mean, that is one of the dreadful things of online shopping. You know, people buying things, seeing something advertised as being absolutely wonderful, local, perfect, and you find that it's somebody less than honest. How's that going to be prevented?
Well, that will be down to the due diligence of the company that we bring in. I can't say that I'm an expert in that, but there are platforms running very, very successful, and they will go through a rigorous process before we pick the one for Hammersmith and Fulham.
Because I mean, that is something that concerns me. There are a lot of vulnerable people out there, and people will want to be local. They want to support local, but at the same time, we've got to protect them from people who are unscrupulous.
All of the businesses that are engaged in this and who are on the website will also go through a process before they are able to sell online on our H&F platform. They will all be local businesses. They will be vetted properly.
Right, so that will mean that sorry, can I just ask one more question and then I will leave it, if you don't mind, Councillor Vaughan?
No, it's just I wondered whether Councillor Vincent wanted to come in on this point. He might be able to add something further. Councillor Vincent, did you want to say something on this particular?
I did, but I'll let Councillor Alford finish if she wants. I mean, the only point I was going to make 2 points. One is that this scheme has been put to the business network. In other words, local businesses have seen the idea. They've had presentations from 2 different providers, and they are very enthusiastic. So the first point is they want it. Most local businesses understand that we're all going more digital, and I entirely take Councillor Alford's point that we've got to be very careful about scams and everything, because there are outrageous things going on. The second point is that the businesses themselves have warned us that it isn't going to work, and again, this is Councillor Alford's point, unless people there is a good marketing plan, and therefore we have a lot of people who are supporting us in local business who want to see that it is rolled out properly, both for businesses to actually participate in it and know how they do it and what they need to do it, because it will involve them actually doing some work on it and constantly keeping up to date. And secondly, so that local residents know it's there and will realise it's there and will use it. And there is a budget hopefully being set aside to do that. That just shows that we've actually been using local businesses to bounce this off, and they are behind it and are supporting it.
think if I could just ask one further question, which carries into what we've been talking about, is we're talking about startup businesses and helping them and people who are, you know, from all sorts of things. They won't have the history or the background to be able to produce necessarily the information that we'll want to be sure that they're, or the company will be sure that they are suitable. How's that going to work? If you know, a startup business suddenly thinks they want to be involved in the online marketing, but they don't have a history. I'm sorry, you're muted.
We will vet all businesses, but certainly I don't know whether you ever went to the a lot of the businesses engaged in this will be bricks and mortar businesses who need to have every opportunity to trade, so both in store and online. But we will certainly be pushing it out to businesses like our artists and our designer makers who were in the Made in H&F shop. I don't know whether you ever went there in Hammersmith.
I did indeed, yes.
Yes, and so this will provide them a really good opportunity to trade and sell to residents in the borough, and all businesses will be properly vetted, and we will use the e-commerce platform supplier who are professionals who will be setting up a proper consolidation hub in the borough to help us develop that process.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Councillor Vaughan, for letting me ask quite so many questions.
Not at all. Thanks very much, Councillor Orford. Let's just move on, and we'll maybe come back as necessary later. Councillor Rowbottom, you're next. Thanks for your patience.
No problem. Thank you very much. A small question and a bigger question, if I may. So the small question is just, I noticed in the report that the business advice clinics were really popular and were selling out. I wondered, I know a lot of this is subject to people's time over and above, you know, day jobs, so people who've been advising and supporting our local businesses, but I wondered if there was potential to expand that if they were so popular. And then my second question, which I know I've been returning to over several of these meetings, is about whether we have a sense of the appetite for office space. I know that this report is particularly for smaller businesses, so I wondered if we had a sense of what what the office development or utilisation landscape looks like across the borough for different kinds of businesses, particularly small businesses. Will they need more flexi space, or is there sufficient space enough? I wondered if there'd been any work or just anecdotal evidence about the direction of travel with that.
Well, who wants to jump in there? Sorry, Karen, is that?
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Councillor Rowbottom. It's a really interesting question, and I know you've raised it before, and we are really actively seeking as much workspace as we possibly can, but affordable workspace. That's part of one of the objectives of the industrial strategy. So you're probably aware that we've got 600,000 square feet of new flexible workspace up at White City, scale space that, you know, is completely full and is housing startups and scale-ups, and there is always a demand for that kind of space. Your question about commercial office space is a difficult one to answer at the moment. Patricia alluded to it when she was speaking about the fact that we're seeing a return of office workers, but as Councillor Jones also said, we've got one of the highest rates of people working from home in this borough, because we've got a lot of professional and managerial people, and so at the moment it's a difficult one to call. I don't know whether Councillor Jones wants to add anything to this. I mean, we're keeping a watching brief on it, and obviously we will want to commission some studies into what's happening with the commercial market. But I think right now it's difficult because we're still in that kind of transition phase and not really knowing how bigger companies are going to manage their workforces in the future. We're getting a mixed response, but on the whole, most of the larger companies in Hammersmith and Fulham are encouraging people to stay at home at this point in time, I would say.
I might, if I may, Councillor Vaughan, just come back. It's a really interesting and it's a very complex question. I think I know that we have a lot of working for sort of people who are resident here. A lot of them work from home because they were previously commuting into the city. But I guess it was more for businesses. I suppose the acid test is, are developments still going ahead? I suppose you've cited scale space. It would be really interesting across the borough to see if developments are still going ahead, because they're not, they're not going to be building unless there's money in it. So it would just be really interesting to see. They'll have done a lot of the market research, as it were, for us. If things are still going ahead and being built, that's kind of fascinating. Has implications for rent and everything else, and who will be staying in the borough, the bounce back, the economy. It just, I think, is quite a key question. I get that this is.
I mean, one of I mean, Hammersmith and Fulham is in a very good place to pick up on all of that, because we're seeing a bit of a movement from the central London boroughs, but we're not seeing a downturn in demand for office space here, and that's because of our location. So we've got proximity to Heathrow, we've got Old Oaken, HS2 coming. There's almost a shift to the west, because expensive office space in central London is no longer required. I mean, we've had inquiries from the likes of Microsoft and others about space in this part of London. I can see Councillor Jones has got his hand up, so I'll let him come in here because he might have some more sentiment data to add to that.
I mean, I haven't got specific data, but just to add that Karen's right in relation to our experience around land development in the borough. I mean, I think in terms of the sort of White City area, we're seeing inbound anchor businesses coming in. So in terms of demand for office space now, it's there. We've got more demand for affordable shared space than we can meet, but we will seek to meet that through our strategy. And as Karen said, there is something quite complex, as you said, going on about the relationship between central London and West London. But I think our location means, combined with the growth of the innovation district, that we've got quite a high level of demand. That said, the only other thing I'd add on sort of a soft data sense of what's in the planning applications is I think there is a reconsideration by developers of the nature of office buildings. So clearly there is a shift towards hybrid. It depends on the business. So that said, it's not office development as usual 2019. I think there is a change, but in terms of absolute demand for space, that seems to still be there, and we're still being approached by investors and potential developers.
Thank you.
So I can see that Paul Kelly's got his hand on. Paul, did you want to comment on this particular point?
Yes, so it was just a very quick comment. Something that may be worth looking at, and discussions I had a couple of years ago, is the availability of meanwhile space, and utilise that meanwhile space to create basically container parks or box cities. A lot of businesses, particularly smaller businesses, still can't afford to go to some of these let's just call them posh offices, so some of these new state-of-the-art offices. So the creation of a box city style innovation hub or office space could be a good platform or springboard to move on to more established permanent spaces. And I think the way office space is going to be used over the next couple of years is going to be more of an intermediate thing. Working from home, people will start going back to offices, but it's not going to be everyone. It's not going to be all the time. So the demand for temporary space is going to, over the next couple of years, is probably going to be a lot bigger than a lot of people anticipate.
Thank you very much, Paul. Councillor Jones, did you want to?
Just very quickly, I mean, Paul is absolutely right. We have actually been doing some of that over recent years. We had metal box containers on a meanwhile site in Shepherd's Bush, and we're looking at it elsewhere, and that's absolutely right. I think it was pretty successful. It's obviously been, the pandemic's intervened in terms of thinking around who's in physical spaces, but that's something that I think is absolutely a really good point about meanwhile space.
Councillor Rowbottom, I'm not sure we've answered your first question. I'll have to remind me what it was.
It was about the very popular business advice clinics.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say something on that. Yeah, they're hugely successful. We've got four of our advisors at the moment, and the ARG funds that are coming in will allow us to expand that service.
Brilliant, thank you.
Significantly, if we want.
Great, thank you very much.
No, I'd certainly second the comment there. It looked like those were very popular. So clearly there's a lot of demand there. So to the extent that we can extend those, that would be great, because it sounded from what you said as though they were booked up pretty quickly, which one can understand. Councillor Rosenberg.
Hi, thank you. Excuse me. This might sound trivial, but it always is a bit of a mystery to me about how far this information goes within the community. I think where you've got biggish businesses, there is nevertheless a network, but it's the little things that are quite hard to locate. For instance, my internet shopping has increased and increased and increased, but if I want to actually get a couple of screws or a nail to hang a picture, it's a question of where do I go? It's the little hardware shops. So now that B&Q and places like that actually have ceased to exist or are not local anymore, and it's very hard to actually work out where you're going to get a tube of glue. How does one measure the number of, or the width of your marketing campaign as to its reach, so that it also encompasses people who are not necessarily people who are working or have internet access or are familiar with working, buying on the internet?
Karen or Nikki, I don't know whether one of you wants to just make a comment on that.
Well, shall I have a go at that?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, I mean, there's various different aspects to it. There is the e-commerce scheme which we are talking about, and as I said, what is important is to actually get a good marketing campaign so that people know it's there and knows what's available on it. And although that doesn't help Councillor Rosenberg's point about if you don't have access to or don't wish to use the internet, that's not going to help you. But there are other points which is the business network is a network of groups who are have their own networks themselves. So the whole point of the business network is to speak to the leaders of those groups, who then pass the information down the line. Again, that doesn't necessarily get to everybody. We've been running campaigns, for instance, you should see lots of posters in windows for the Shop Safe, Shop Local scheme. You'll see the banners up about it. We would love to have an enormous database of every business in the borough, but that is a vast enterprise. We have, I don't know, Nikki will tell me how many people we've got on the business list we have, where we send out business bulletins. So I mean, we are aiming to pick up the businesses first, and then they've got to do their own local marketing. That's fair. Is that helpful, Nikki?
Yeah, one of the other things I would say is, Councillor Rosenberg, is as part of our marketing campaign, we will expect that there will be a huge amount of outreach, actually going to all the high streets and going to visit every single business to distribute information to them, but to also go in and talk to them about the e-commerce project and try and get them engaged, and see also if they need any help regarding digital skills themselves.
And could I just add, one of the really positive things to come out of the work that we've been doing over the pandemic is working with colleagues across the council. So we've been working with licensing officers, environmental health officers, so where sometimes we need to run campaigns to get to those businesses that we don't ordinarily speak to. We've got a lot of people with their feet on the ground, going out and about, talking to businesses. So because we've now been able to work together in a much more kind of cohesive way, I think we can utilise some of the extra resource from across the council to help us as well. For example, you know, we've been trying to talk to Somalian businesses about keeping COVID safe with the reopening, and just having some of our sort of colleagues from environmental health go and speak to those businesses has been hugely helpful. So it's those kind of things we've been able to do just because we've had to kind of group together resources to properly deliver to businesses during the pandemic.
Thank you very much. Councillor Rosenberg, do you have any further questions?
No, I just wanted to say thank you, because that's always been the enormous amount of time it takes to either get a ball of string or a packet of rubber bands or some paper clips. So hopefully all these little things that one needs would be addressed. Thank you.
I can certainly say, Councillor Rosenberg, that if you lived in the north of the borough, particularly in the Askew ward or nearby, certainly one of the businesses there is a hardware shop that's done extremely good business over the years and has benefited, I think, from some of the decline of, for example, Homebase in the near the north of the borough. So, and was actually voted one of the Shepherd's Bush Business of the Year at the Business Awards a couple of years ago. So maybe that's a business that's lacking in Sands End, perhaps. So perhaps there's room for someone to move in there.
Sands End is definitely well out of range of most places. So, I mean, if I want to go to Screwfix, I actually have to cross the river and go into Wandsworth. I mean, it's not far, but it's definitely, I had to search it out because there's no B&Q anymore.
But there is an excellent hardware shop on the Wandsworth Bridge Road.
Yes, that's right. But if you aren't going to actually go there and you want to try and do it online and have it green delivered, if you like, it's, you have to seek it out. So let's hope that we know and we can have a local directory, I think, would be useful, of local businesses that we can contact.
Sounds like there's certainly a gap in the market there, potentially. So thank you for those questions. I'm going to move on to some of my own now, if that's okay. I mean, thanks. First of all, thank all of the officers for and those who've contributed for an excellent discussion tonight. The report, I thought, was both concise and informative, which and there's obviously thank you to everyone who's contributed tonight for the enormous amount of hard work, and please take our thanks back to the teams who have been doing the work, supporting businesses either by grants or by organising the networks and everything else. There's clearly been and continues to be a huge amount of hard work that's gone into that. Delighted to see that all of the grants have been distributed, but note, of course, some of the difficulties that have been noted, particularly by Councillor Vincent on how all of that has worked. We've talked about basically, we could probably spend all night talking about this report because there's a lot of different aspects that you've highlighted, particularly in sort of section 2 of the report. So I won't go into all of those. Certainly to note just on a few points, I think the broadband improvement initiatives, given the hybrid working and residents, is definitely a seriously important thing for, the economy in general, but clearly our economy in Hammersmith and Fulham. We certainly need to ensure that continues. Obviously to note as well that as we're also the Arts, as you know, committee, clearly very close to our hearts, the sort of cultural recovery that you have talked about. Obviously we've heard only, I think yesterday, the problems that Riverside Studios have had with having to count the cancellation of the Kenneth Branagh production, which was going to sort of help in their sort of relaunch now that they've recently reopened, not entirely due to sort of COVID, but obviously due to their works and stuff. But so obviously there continue to be some COVID-related problems and difficulties for the arts sector in Hammersmith and Fulham, and clearly good to see that they've benefited from the Cultural Recovery Fund. We've talked about the advice clinics and a number of these points. I wonder if actually on one of the, we could go through all of these, but I won't. Thank you for all the work that's been done with the business networks. It sounds like those are operating really well. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the, I suppose, looking to the future. There was the talk about over 50s who had been made redundant or otherwise weren't employed during COVID, and the support that had been given to them, and they're starting up new businesses. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. That sounds like an excellent initiative that seems to have worked reasonably well. I'm afraid I can't find the actual reference to it at the moment, but I wonder if someone could say a little bit more about how that's worked and whether that is intended to go further forward. Karen, sorry, I don't know whether you...
Yeah, I was just going to ask Nikki or Sam whether they want to come in on that one. I mean, we've run a number of sessions. There's been excellent take-up, really oversubscribed, and we are planning a further session later this year. I'm not close enough to the detail of how they're run, but I do know they've been really successful. I don't know whether Nikki or Sam, you want to add anything to that? I mean, we could come back, Councillor Vaughan, with some more detail. We'll be publicising further sessions soon, so we can get the message out.
Yeah, sorry, it's in paragraph 2.8, the startup senior school, which is really interesting. Nikki.
Yeah, I lost my connection, and it wasn't a project that I actually led on, although we did procure it. But if you look at the how many people attended, it was a business school that ran over a number of weeks, and then following that, several businesses did successfully set up their own business. The feedback and and our aims from it were massively exceeded, so we will be running another one of those in September, and if there is the same demand, we'll run another one in January as well.
Yeah, no, it sounded a fantastic initiative. I think maybe it's one thing that we might come back to later in the year, perhaps just as to get an update to see how that has worked, to see if there were any well, potentially some of the people who've started up their own businesses can come along and give us an idea of how all of that works, because that sounded really excellent in terms of...
we could ask somebody to come back and talk about their experience and how it's helped them.
Sounded like it's a really good summary in paragraph 2.8 of the report. As I say, thank you for all the work. We could spend a lot of time. I wonder if we could just say a bit more about the high street. I mean, obviously one of the big things is going to be, how all of this works post-COVID, particularly with the acceleration that we've talked about in online, that was sort of there but has been probably accelerated due to COVID. I guess we've talked obviously about getting local businesses, particularly bricks and mortar ones, onto the platform that you've talked about. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more just about the high street and town centre strategy development, which was in paragraph 3.3 of the report. I think obviously there's been some discussion about it earlier on, but exactly how we're planning to work there, because clearly that's going to be a big part of the sort of post-COVID recovery of the borough, is going to be sort of both supporting, I guess, and obviously it will be there for businesses coming back, but I guess there's a lot of unknowns there. But I wonder what further you can just say at this point about what plans are in place there.
Well, we haven't started this work yet, but what we'd like to do is look at all the major town centres and high streets in the borough, and they're all very different and all at different stages in terms of what we know about them. So as Patricia said earlier, Hammersmith Bid is doing a lot of work, and we ourselves, our planning team, has Hammersmith SPD and master plan in the offing, which we are contributing to. So already there's a huge amount going on around Hammersmith that we can build on, and of course we've got the civic campus coming online. So how that impacts on Hammersmith beyond what we already know will be one thing. And then we've got some high streets like Askey Road and Wandsworth Bridge Road, Uxbridge Road, Goldhawk Road, where the data that we've got is minimal probably. So one of the first thing we want to do, the GLA have produced hugely informative data sets using MasterCard data, so data gleaned from transactions that MasterCard have been able to gather, or through their data centre. We can get access to that, so we can better understand what high streets look like. So that the starting point is really gathering all the evidence and information, Some of the work will entail actually going to the high streets, talking to the business associations, talking to the key stakeholders on high streets. It's a big piece of work, and I think we're about to embark on a mapping exercise just to list all the key areas that we're going to be looking at, but also, you know, some are in further down the line in terms of what they know and how they want to take it forward. So, you know, Fulham, North End Road, we've got a huge amount of information and data on, and plans already in the making for those areas. We're really pleased that Wandsworth Bridge Road got the money from the GLA as part of the High Street Challenge. Councillor Vincent mentioned that, because that will give them, they will get a pot of money that they can utilise to form partnerships to really build up a picture for what they need down there. So it's a big piece of work. We need to take it one step at a time, but obviously we'll be consulting with the business network and with members to take that forward.
Excellent. No, thank you very much, Karen. I think that's that and you've given us a lot of food for thought here in this presentation, including around that. So I suspect it's something that we'll want to bring back at some point in the future to have a discussion, particularly around how that policy is going to sort of develop and that strategy. I don't know whether there are any final comments from anyone at this point, from Councillor Jones or Councillor Vincent.
I'll just say back in just what Karen said. I think I'm right in saying we've got 26 high streets in the borough, which, when you actually think about it, it takes you a long time to work out where they are, because you always assume it's just King Street, Shepherd's Bush, and North End Road. So there's a lot of work to do, and I think the important point is, it's whilst we've got an overarching industrial strategy, which is great, ultimately the local stuff has got to be driven by the local business, the local residents. And as Karen said, that's a lot of work to do. But the CRM system, which we're going to be buying into, will provide a lot of raw data to build on. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to do, and working with local businesses, using the money wisely. Hopefully we can do an awful lot to make sure that all those 26 high streets, wherever they are, will be flourishing.
Councillor Jones.
Yeah, just to add to that, I agree with Guy. I mean, obviously the wider industrial strategy is aimed at producing sort of growth of a certain form, which involves inward investment. But I mean, this is very much about local businesses and engaging the whole of the economy in the borough. And as we come out of the pandemic, as Guy said, it's, we're going to have to inflect and pivot, I think, around what the world looks like and support small businesses to do that. Nobody quite knows what the high street's going to look like, but we've got some ideas. I think we've innovated, I think, in Karen's team in supporting small businesses, but we need to keep doing that, because as Guy said, the uncertainty remains. I think some industries, as I said before, are very challenged, and that could take longer than perhaps some are anticipating at the moment. So it is about businesses, small businesses within the borough, giving them the opportunity to respond to this new world that we are emerging into, and to continue to thrive.
Thank you very much, Councillor Jones. Can I just say thank you all again for the report, all of the work that's been done, and I'm grateful if you could take our thanks back to all of those who've been involved who aren't here tonight. I think we're very impressed with everything that's you've managed to do during COVID. Clearly, it's not over yet, so there's certainly both more to do on the getting through COVID and the sort of post-COVID recovery. But there's a lot of interesting work that we will want to take forward. I won't mention all of the points, but I think we've covered them. Really, really exciting developments, potentially to try and get our small businesses onto digital platforms and other things. So. Yeah, really, thank you very much for all of the work during COVID and for the strategy that is coming out of COVID. We'll be really interested to, I think you've probably taken on board the points that we've given today, and we'll list those in the minutes and elsewhere. We'll be interested, I think, to pick up on some of the specific aspects for future discussion at this committee, sort of later in this year, next year, and on from that. So, thank you all for contributing tonight, and basically for all the work that's been done. I think we're very grateful for the support that small businesses, large and small, are getting in the borough. So
Thank you.
with that, thank you all. We'll just pause for 30 seconds before to move on to the next one. Thank you all for attending tonight, and we'll pause just to move on to our next agenda item. Thank you all for attending. Now. Okay, so we've noted and commented on that report. Item 6 is improving private sector housing through discretionary property licensing. And welcome to Councillor Brown, you've joining the meeting. So this report sets out the steps taken to improve private sector housing through discretionary property licensing. I think this is an issue that we have discussed before, but there's a renewal coming up of the licensing that we will be talking about as part of this item. So again, can I remind officers just to introduce themselves when they first address the committee? And first of all, can I ask Ed Shaler to introduce this item? Ed, over to you.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Ed Shaler, I'm the private sector housing manager, which sits in the environment group. You'll have a report in your agenda pack that starts on page 21 in your PAC agenda item 6. And I'm going to endeavour to share my screen because we've got a short slideshow. There are only 8 slides, I should say, so please do not fear. It's not going to take overly long. So the first point to make is that, as you probably are well aware, we have a large private rented sector in the borough, and it's one of the largest in London. And I can't seem to get the slide to move on to the next slide, which is a little bit annoying. I'll just end the slideshow and then start it again and see if that helps. What I might do is just what I'll do is just leave it on the screen like that rather than trying to run it as a slideshow. So hopefully you can still see the slides, and you'll tell me if you can't. So we brought in the discretionary licensing schemes for houses and flats in multiple occupation across the whole borough in 2017, and also the what's called selective licensing, which is all flats and houses which are rented to tenants in the streets that had the poorest property conditions and the highest levels of antisocial behaviour in the borough: noise, littering, fly tipping, that kind of thing. And there were 128 streets in that scheme. This may be helpful to you just from the borough profile in 2018, where the highest percentages of private rented properties are in the borough. You'll see they are primarily in the middle wards, the blue and the green shaded wards. Possibly in the north there's a greater percentage of social housing, so the private rented sector slightly lower, but it's really high across the borough. We don't really need to take too much notice of where the shadings are, although you'll see North End and Avonmore and Brook Green, over 40% of domestic property there is privately rented, but it's high at 30%, clearly because prices to purchase property are very high, and it's also very popular with people who are not necessarily setting down long-term routes, but they want accommodation for work reasons or for lifestyle reasons, to make renting an attractive possibility for them. So these schemes will expire in 2022, in June next year. So we're undertaking a public consultation now, which is open from May until August. The borough can put 20% of the borough's private rented sector into a selective licensing scheme by its own authority. If it wanted to put more than 20%, it would need approval from the Secretary of State. And our proposed scheme is just under the 20% threshold. But it's worth pointing out that HMO licensing is borough-wide. So all houses and flats in multiple occupation, whether they're very large, and we have some with, approximately approaching 100 rooms in the borough. We have many others with 12 or 14 rooms. but we also have flats with only 3 sharers, which constitutes a flat in multiple occupation. And that licensing scheme, it is proposed, will be borough-wide. So just some indications, and the materials in the report. The tenant consultation is on page 38, 39 of your pack, probably the last few pages, Appendix 5. We surveyed some private rented tenants, and on the next slide, I've just got some examples of what they found, which meant that all was not completely well with the private rented, their satisfaction with it. We also found from our preliminary findings of the current consultation, which is Appendix 3, page 34, that so far more than 80% of tenants are in favour of the licensing schemes. So it's popular with tenants. It's fair to say it's much less popular with landlords, and about 3/4 of landlords have said that they are not in favour of selective licensing, and about 2/3 of landlords are not in favour of HMO licensing. There is a fee to be paid for a landlord to obtain the licence, and there are conditions and minimum standards that landlords are expected to comply with. And it's fair to say that some landlords see this as unnecessary regulation and an unnecessary burden, although a minority do see that licensing helps to deal with the poorer landlords in the sector, who some tell us that they feel that they're competing with people who are less keen to comply with all necessary regulations, and that that's unfair competition. So there are a minority of landlords actually in favour of licensing. Number 4 is housing standards. We have found in flats and houses in multiple occupation in particular some deficiencies, lack of fire doors on kitchens that are just too small, landlords trying to cram too many occupiers into small accommodation, or that the rooms themselves are too small. And one final point, which is the point about where the council is a freeholder and a leaseholder has purchased the flat on a leaseholder, sometimes many years ago, sometimes it's changed hands several times since, and it's now sublet to tenants. There's nothing wrong with subletting in itself, but sometimes alterations have been made to the interior of the flat without permission, and they are being over-occupied by sharing tenants, which puts pressure on the building infrastructure, and is something that in environment and in the housing department we're keen to reduce that from happening. So here are just the picking up the points from the tenant consultation in Appendix 5 in visual form. And I must just say I'm grateful to Valerie Simpson for putting these slides together for me today. She did a very good job. It's fair to say that the sample of survey replies wasn't particularly large. It was about 100. So I wouldn't want you to read too much into the sort of slightly alarming figures there about 1 in 5 not having a carbon monoxide detector and 1 in 4 not having a gas safety certificate. I think it's fair to say that people who take the trouble to respond to surveys commissioned by the council, whether or not by anybody else, is usually because they've got a point to make. So it may well be that the tenants' replies reflects those that were unhappy, perhaps to a slightly larger degree than if you were able to survey everyone. So just to conclude the presentation and then invite you for questions, there is our consultation, which is on the council's website and has been promoted. We've sent, there's details of who we consulted on page 25 in the report, 13,000 leaflets to tenants' addresses in the selective licensing streets and various electronic platforms to promote the consultation. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Ed. Sorry, trouble getting off mute. If you can take the presentation down, Ed, sorry, then I can probably see it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'll stop sharing.
That's all right.
I should have remembered to do that. Sorry.
Any questions or comments on that presentation? So I've got Councillor Rowbottom, Councillor Rosenberg, and Councillor Alford. Councillor Rowbottom.
Thank you, and Ed, thank you for this presentation. It sounds like a great initiative and very interesting. Although I imagine sort of you meet a bit of resistance on the road. I wondered if you could talk through sort of how it works, the impact on the tenants. Oh, sorry, can everyone here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you are that, for instance, group of students where you've used the reception room as the bedroom to make it economical because you don't want to be living in zone whatever 5 and commuting in, how would that play out, these policies in improving the situation for people without meaning that they sort of found themselves unable to continue living in that space under the sort of conditions that you had set as a bare minimum?
Yeah, it's a balancing act which we are very aware of, to try and keep accommodation as affordable as possible without reducing the minimum standards to such a degree that people are effectively renting a broom cupboard, which we certainly don't want to happen. So we do allow flats and houses where all the rooms are used as bedrooms. So there's the living room is used for sleeping accommodation. Some landlords tell us that that's the room that gives them the profit, especially if they're a buy-to-let landlord. So they need that last tenant. And some tenants tell us that they don't mind paying a bit less rent for a smaller room. But we feel we have to draw the line somewhere so that people are not sleeping in boxes. And imagine what it would be like in weather like this if your only space that was your own was your bedroom and you had to live, eat and sleep all in the same room. So it will be 10 square meters, which is approximately 110 square feet in old money. So basically a double bedroom, a modest sized double bedroom will be adequate for one person if there's no separate living room. If there is a separate living room, and in houses it's not uncommon for there either to be a separate living room or perhaps more commonly an open plan kitchen and living room, which is quite large, it has to be 6.5 square meters or 70 square feet, which is like a single bedroom. And that's actually a government minimum. So we're not allowed to let landlords rent accommodation which is less than 6.5. But we are aware that it's a balancing act, because if we make the standards too high, supply will reduce and rents for what's left will be too high. So it is a balancing act, but we feel we have to draw the line somewhere. Otherwise, the standards just ever decrease until you get to the point where it's very difficult to turn the clock back. Once landlords have made alterations to properties and converted them, it will be very difficult for us to come along and tell them they've got to undo all the work and revert it back.
If I might come in as a follow-up, then I suppose the vision for what this would do for who could rent and in what conditions in Hammersmith and Fulham, where of course we know the demand is so high that even given COVID, I think the rent has averagely dropped. This is West London 11%, but it's still not seeing the drops of other areas, which shows people, for all the other reasons we've mentioned in this committee, still want to be here. So what would be the sort of positive vision of impact on who could live where and in what conditions from these policies?
Well, I guess we would like to see rents drop, perhaps less so for landlords who will see it as income dropping. But rents are incredibly high. One bedroom flat often £1,850 if it's in a smart new development. A room in a shared house, £700 or £800 a month, and that's just for a room. And it's really a question of competition for the tenants, especially last year when there were far fewer tenants renting in the borough than there would normally be, because they'd gone home to work from home or moved elsewhere because their jobs had gone. So landlords were competing for tenants and reducing rents accordingly. But our primary job is to maintain the standards, and licensing has other benefits apart from increasing the quality of the property which is licensed. It also makes it a lot easier, for want of a better phrase, to flush out rogue landlords who don't come forward for licenses. As a broad generalization, rogue landlords don't apply for licenses. Good landlords usually do. So by publicizing our amenity standards and conditions, landlords know what we expect when they apply for a license. And if they complete a valid license application, we're happy with what they're providing. And then by a process of elimination, we can work out the rented properties which don't have a license and are more likely to be problematic. And of course, some of those are seriously problematic, and those are the ones we're really looking for. Thanks,
Ed. If I'm sorry, Councillor Vaughan, if I might just with one more, it's it's a really, I can already think of pieces of casework I've received where I've not quite known where to go, because it always feels like, you know, the purview of the private sector is very hard to penetrate, not least to find out who the landlords are. So I suppose, do you have a sense of, I wonder what your contact rate, as it were, is for landlords, at least on the streets you're piloting and across the borough beyond the 120 odd streets? Is there a way for us or for residents directly to alert when, for instance, they don't have a live, an in-date gas safety certificate, which is a piece of casework in my inbox right now?
Well, aside from licensing, the other part of environmental health work in private housing is looking at disrepair and failure to comply with regulations and what may result, which is a housing hazard, such as an unsafe gas lines or an unsafe electrical installation. So any resident can email phs@lbhf, so that's Private Housing Services, or go on the website and look at the private housing pages to pick up the phone numbers and the email addresses of how to report. So our officers are authorised to follow up with landlords who are reported as not having complied with the basic regulation, and our officers will give the tenant lots of advice about what private or civil action they could take against their landlord, which are considerable. If anyone who has a basic knowledge of landlord and tenant law will know that it's a very extensive piece of law, and there are lots of regulations for landlords, not least to tell their tenants their name and address, which is something that even some people are not aware of. So yes, they can report to Private Housing Services, and if you, the In Touch team at Member Services will send it our way, and we will make an approach to the landlord. Normally, our first approach is a sympathetic one to the landlord to inquire what the situation is. We may get a different story from the landlord than we would from the tenant. Maybe that it's tenant's responsibility in some cases for disrepair or damage. So we will hear both sides and form a judgment what happens next, and we will give landlords an opportunity to rectify. The example you gave, of course, is an offence. So not having an in-date gas safety certificate is an offence under the gas safety installation regulations anyway. So there are a few things to do with housing which are an offence under the law without any notice. But the great majority of housing improvements are undertaken under notice. So the landlord is informed first what they should have done, and they're given a period of time to rectify it. And in many cases, both parties end up happy. That's what we're hoping for.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Rosenberg, did you have a question?
No, because Helen asked it for me.
Oh, great, thank you. Councillor Alford.
And I'll try and keep them as brief, but I have got quite a few questions. Mr. Shaler, I've spent a long time being interested in housing, and I spent many years fighting the Ahmeds. So I've had a long experience of landlords in this borough, good and bad. But I would like a bit more clarification on certain things. The selective licensing, which is for rented dwellings in certain areas, does that mean that if you have a flat, you can only have 3 tenants, or if you have 3 tenants, that has to be licensed?
Well, we have 2 separate schemes, so it's important to distinguish between them. Selective licensing, which we are proposing, will be on 23 main roads in the borough, would be for any flat or house which is rented to a tenant. So even if it was a single tenant.
Right.
House in multiple occupation, or flats in multiple occupation, because it's the same thing, is where you've got 3 or more people who are not related to each other. So effectively house sharers. There are 1 or 2 exemptions. One will be where the landlord lives in and has lodgers. That's not a house in multiple occupation. But if it's rented to 3 sharers, then it would be. And we're proposing to license all HMOs across the borough as we do now.
And have you licensed everybody? I mean, the people who used to live next door to me, I doubt if they had a HMO license, though they had 4 young men living in there.
Well, do tell us the address and the details, and we'll be happy to follow it up.
They sold it.
But we estimated in 2017 we would have approximately 4,100 of each type, selectives and HMOs. that we could bring under license. And we've tipped over 3,000 with about a year to go. So we may not get all the way to the 4,100 in the remaining 11 months, but I think we'll get quite close to it. And since last year, when we filled some staff vacancies and rebooted the private sector housing team in a good way with some enthusiastic new staff, and reinvigorated our existing staff, who you may remember were previously shared with Kensington and Chelsea up until 2019. So since we split with Kensington and Chelsea, we've reinvigorated the team, and officers are now out on a daily basis, knocking on doors, as well as doing desktop research to flush out rented properties which should have a license and don't. The rented sector is about 27,000 according to the 10-year-old census, so we'll have to look at the new census data when it arrives. We think there are probably 20% of that number is just over 5,000. So we're aiming over the next 5 years, or 5 years, 11 months, to bring 5,000, some of which will be the same properties, of course, coming around for a second time. Others will be new properties, because there's a lot of churn in the rented sector. As you rightly say, Councillor, houses get sold. Sometimes they're used for multiple occupation for a year or two. Then those tenants leave and it reverts back to a single family. There's a lot of churn in even amongst large HMOs. There are only a few that are permanent.
Right. There are sort of various issues that are arising out of this. One of the things that I do have strong views about. We've had problems, which you do allude to, of certain leaseholders who bought council properties who have altered them beyond all measure. Now, those people I have no sympathy with whatsoever, and I think every enforcement should be taken about. What I'm a little concerned about in your wording is, are you saying that you're not going to let any leaseholder sublet? And I mean, they should let the leasehold department know anyway. So that's part of, if they don't do that, that's breach of their lease. But are you saying you're trying to stop current leaseholders subletting, or are you not saying that?
Only if they sublet to sharers, so 3, 4, 5 or more sharers. No problem with them subletting to 2 sharers or a single person or a family. But in discussion with my colleagues in the housing department and in the leasehold services and the property maintenance, they're concerned about the pressure on the infrastructure of some of these quite aged blocks, which were not designed for the number of adults which are currently occupying them. So where the landlord applies for an HMO license and they have tenants in situ already, we will give them a 2-year license with a condition that they bring the multiple occupancy use to an end, or seek a waiver to the policy from the housing department. So if they've got a particular reason why they want to carry on, they can ask for a waiver. But of course, the idea of the policy is try to reduce as much as possible multiple occupancy use.
So, for instance, you have a 3-bedroom flat, for instance. I'm using that as an example, and there are 3 single girls in it. Again, without being sexist, just giving. Would they be granted a waiver? Because if it's 3 bedrooms, then 3 people would be living in it anyway. How would that be?
The details of who might qualify for a waiver are still being worked through. This proposal will be at Cabinet in December for the decision. So I think it's likely that between now and then, there'll be decisions made with the housing leadership as to what criteria they might apply to waivers. The example you give is perhaps the mildest form of house share, where you've got 3 responsible single people sharing. But what's very common is you've got bedrooms being used as doubles, a 2-bedroom flat with one as a double, one as a single.
That I don't have a problem with. That's what I thought. I prefaced my remarks by saying over occupancy I don't have a problem with. What I do concerns me is perfectly people who've been living there for quite a considerable amount of time, very responsible, having their whole lives thrown out and disrupted because we haven't thought it through, is what I'm saying. It's one thing to have 3 bedrooms and 3 people in it, to having 3 bedrooms and 6 people in it. That's what I'm trying to make the point.
No, good point, very well made, and I've made a note of that.
the other thing, sorry, Councillor Vaughan, I hope you let me have a little bit longer, is undersized kitchens. How do you consider, how big does a kitchen have to be? And again, does it vary whether you've got 2, 3 or 10?
If you ask an environmental health officer, you would expect them to have a smart answer. So we say 4 metres. That's a bit like those kitchens you see in IKEA, where there's a worktop approximately 4 metres long and a similar amount of standing space in front of the worktop. So that would be for up to 4 people. And then we would add a square metre for each additional person. So if there are 5 people sharing a house, we would expect the kitchen to be 5 square metres.
Right.
And 6 people 6. That's what we think is the bare minimum. Many boroughs have higher standards, like 7 metres, but we have to be realistic with the type of accommodation we have in the borough.
Right, and so it's really the workspace, cupboards, pro rata, so that it works out that way. So a galley, again, practical points, a galley kitchen would be acceptable. It wouldn't have to be a full.
Yes, yeah, a worktop is 600 mil wide. So if it's 4 metres long, you've only got 400 mil to stand in front of it. So that would be a galley kitchen, and that's what we think would be the bare minimum. Right.
And the other question is about, I know we talked a bit earlier about 2 smaller bedrooms, and I've got one final point after this. Now, if you, again, I'm afraid I have to use it because where we live, I live in the Crabtree estate. Now, basically, it has 2 double bedrooms and a small, a small room. Would that be acceptable for one person? I mean, I wouldn't put 2 people in it ever. You couldn't get them.
It makes a difference if it's for family occupation or as multiple occupancy by sharers. If it was a family, it would probably be the smallest member of the family that has the smallest bedroom. And that's quite normal, and it's been that way for decades, if not centuries. If it's for sharers, where each person is paying a big chunk of the rent individually, it has to be 6.5 metres minimum if there's a living room, and if there's no living room, because all the rooms are used for bedrooms, 10 square metres.
And my final point is actually about the licensing, particularly the selective. And again, I will declare an interest that one of my friends has 1 flat, which she's actually disposing of. But the difficulty she found as a fairly read lady, and I had to do the licensing for her. She found it so complicated. Now, I understand with multiple landlords, when they're used to doing it all the time, they just have somebody who just ticks all the boxes. For, shall we say, a person who has 1 flat, they don't know what they're doing. I mean, you can't expect them to. She didn't feel she was getting very much support from.
Well, I'm sorry to hear if that was the case, and I won't deny that may well have been the case. As I say before, a few years ago, probably about 2019, the licensing scheme was quite new, and it was a little bit chaotic at times. What we have got in place now is that our licensing officers will take phone calls and emails from people who are having difficulty completing the application form, which is online. You won't be surprised to know, as we've issued about 6,000 licenses. Yeah. So, yeah. The good news is we don't have a 16-page paper form anymore, which I guess people used to complain about in the past. But what we now have is an electronic online form, which is not everybody's favourite method, I'll concede. So if people email phs@lbhf or go on the website and pick up the phone numbers, we will eventually get back to them. If they leave a voicemail, if they have to, I'll get an officer to call them back and give them some help. We've got some landlords who still write checks because they don't do online banking, and some that don't have internet. So we've got to do that when we have to.
Sorry, can I ask one more question, Councillor Vaughan, and then I promise I will be, which has been very interesting. I was, you may not, probably don't know, but I was very involved with the prosecution of certain rogue landlords, and I have, as I said, absolutely no time whatsoever for them. You've talked about certain prosecutions, but what sort of prosecutions have you been talking about? Are these small one-off landlords, or are these people who have been rogue landlords that we really have to deal with very firmly?
Well, they're more rogue than one-off. There's no benefit, there's no public interest in prosecuting a sort of relatively innocent accidental landlord. Each individual case is different, and people may or may not want to be called a rogue landlord. I remember one landlord that we prosecuted last year, which was for conversions in Wilmslow Road, which are very unpopular with the neighbours. He objected to being called a rogue landlord and actually threatened us with a libel suit. So we need to be careful with our choice of language.
I didn't call any particular person that. I just referred to.
No, I'm sure it's commonly used, and we have an enforcement policy. We talk about education, persuasion, prevention, and we will only take prosecutions or serve financial penalties if we think the landlord knew what they were doing and were culpable, because otherwise they can be invited to apply for a license or rectify hazards in their property voluntarily, and there's no need to take any further action.
So you basically just do it when it is the last straw, that they're not responding to subtle persuasion. And
it's a little bit earlier than the last straw, because we want to send deterrent messages out and get it known around the borough that Hammersmith and Fulham is one of those boroughs that does take enforcement action. There are a sector of landlords who believe that some boroughs either don't have the resources or don't have the knowledge and capability to effectively take enforcement action, and they'll therefore hide under the hedge, hoping that they never get found. So we do want the message to go around that won't happen in this borough.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Councillor Vaughan, for being so patient with me.
No, thank you very much, Councillor Alford. Sorry, Councillor Rosenberg, you've been waving your hand. I don't know whether you're trying to attract my attention or no. Okay. Ms. Shea, thank you very much for the presentation. I just had possibly a couple of questions there. I think you've heard obviously a number of the points that we'd obviously like to take on board. I think some of those that Councillor Alford made, particularly in regard to waivers and everything else, and I guess, as you've sort of alluded to, there might be some cases where that might be appropriate if, for example, there are a 3-bedroom property that's being sublet, let's say, to 3 individual sharers, for example, on that's a form where the council's the freeholder. I mean, I think that probably what you've heard from us is that we think is that this scheme seems a sensible one to continue with, in the sense that presumably in terms of licensing HMOs and having this selective approach, and I think perhaps you can talk a little bit more about it. I think you're cutting down a number of streets where you are going to do this selective licensing. And actually, in fact, the first question is, I suppose if you could just say a little bit more about why you've, I think it's in the report, but why you've decided to reduce the number of streets where you do the selective licensing, and what that would mean in practice. I think what you were saying was that most of the sort of complaints and issues tended to come from those streets that were sort of main roads rather than the other 100 or so roads which were sort of quieter for one reason or another. But what will the sort of impact of that be? Presumably it will just be that clearly there'll be fewer properties that need to be licensed, but you're perhaps focusing your attention on the areas where you think you're more likely to see problems.
It's definitely the latter. Yes, we want to focus on particular areas, and although the 23 streets proposed are very large streets, some of them, Fulham Road, Uxbridge Road, Goldhawk Road, they've typically got about 1,500 residential addresses on each of those roads. So although they're large roads, it will be a lot easier for our department and our colleague departments like the law enforcement team, street scene enforcement, planning enforcement, to concentrate our efforts in smaller areas. Bearing in mind the licensing scheme lasts for 5 years, that's a good chunk of time, to tackle these roads piece by piece, because you can't do the whole of Fulham Road in one go. You'd have to tackle a section of it, flats above shops, and work on them thoroughly. The reduction in the number is deliberate, and it is remarkable. I'll grant that. 128 down to 23. The data for the existing scheme, which started in 2017, goes all the way back to 2014. So a lot can change in 7 years. And when we've rerun the data, which brought up those 128 as being the top 20% in terms of problems. A lot of those streets don't seem to have those problems, and we've had officers walking those streets, doing street surveys and talking to residents and finding out what they think about the roads. And many times the officers came back and said, everything's fine in that road, there's very little problem, so we don't need to continue with that. So the intent, it will be the same number of addresses because they're much bigger roads. So we're looking at this magic 5,000, which is about 20% of the size of the private rented sector. So it'll have a very similar number of addresses, and therefore the licensing income will be very similar, which means that we can continue to employ the same number of enforcement officers as we do now.
Okay. Sure. So I thought one of the things that came up is sort of in terms of the way these sort of schemes operate is I suppose, how often do you do surveys, particularly of tenants? Because clearly, although the actual number that you got back was relatively small, it clearly pointed to some issues, some of which probably we've seen as councillors through our casework. In particular, things around rubbish and waste collection. It seems surprising to me that people didn't know the days on which they should be putting stuff out. Clearly, there are often issues in, I guess, particularly in HMOs, around not having adequate rubbish disposal. And I know that there was a case, particularly in my ward, that one of my colleagues was taking up recently, where that was a complaint. But I wonder, in terms of how you operate the scheme and looking at these things, how you pick up, do you pick up some thematic issues such as that, and how would you sort of try and tackle them? I mean, it's difficult potentially on a case-by-case basis, but if you're getting the impression that there's lots of gas safety certificates not being given, or that rubbish and this collection is a real problem and is not being advised appropriately, how would this sort of scheme help you to sort of tackle that? And what sort of day-to-day correspondence do you get, if any, from sort of tenants, I guess?
Yes, and I hope you could still see me. As luck would have it, I'm not normally online at 8:15, and I've got the sun shining straight in my face through an open window. But it's difficult to consult with tenants because unless they've got a real axe to grind, let's face it, they're not very likely to respond to a council consultation. So despite putting 13,000 leaflets through letterboxes for occupiers, we didn't get that many replies. But what we do have is a steady stream of, for want of a better word, complaints from tenants about their landlords coming into the PHS mailbox or through the customer contact centre, who will take a report from a tenant and they will know to route it through to us, or of course a councillor inquiry on iCasework. So we have powers to deal with all sorts of issues to do with domestic property. I think there was a point made earlier that there's a general feeling amongst a large part of the population that the private sector is a bit of a closed book, and that because it's private, there's not a lot we can do. But it's actually private residences and dwellings are one of the most heavily regulated areas in terms of public health and housing regulation that there is. So we have lots of powers. Whether we choose to use them or not, of course, depends if it's proportionate. And they come in on a one-to-one, a case-by-case basis. Where the licensing scheme will help is that it enables us to join up with the law enforcement team and planning enforcement and street cleansing. So if we wanted to do a project on a small section of a busy main road, which has got flats above shops and planning issues, commercial premises converted into residential, and litter and rubbish, we can tackle it all as one, as a bespoke project. And the licensing income, to be frank, gives us the resources to do that, because we can employ staff as we employ our existing staff to do that project, as well as enabling us by process of elimination to flush out landlords who haven't applied for licenses.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think that the tenor of our comments obviously is that I think we support this scheme continuing to go forward on HMOs across the borough, and we sort of note certainly the reasons for the focus that you're going to bring to the selective licensing scheme. I hope you'll take up some of the points that have been, and I guess there's plenty of time between now and December, that we've made in terms of the sort of, particularly Councillor Orford's points in terms of the precise workings of the scheme. But I think you've outlined the fact that in particular, if there are HMOs in council properties, there is a 2-year period of grace period for people to potentially rectify that issue or apply for a waiver should that be appropriate. So I think thank you for the presentation and the work that you and your team and others are doing to address some of these issues. I think they've probably given some food for thought in terms of broader or more specific issues around private sector housing that we might want to come back to as a committee at some point in the future, and we'll certainly look forward to seeing the sort of final proposal in terms of renewing the scheme when it comes forward in December. But I think there's probably, as I say, I think there's probably some food for thought there in terms of issues, particularly the sorts of stuff that we get as councillors. And I guess it's highlighted some very key and interesting points about the sort of 30% size of the private rented sector across the borough in terms of dwellings. So I think a very helpful, I mean, possibly always going to be timely, but timely and useful presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
For coming on tonight. Good to meet you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, just to get back to my notes, I think we have commented on the that report. So I think that all that remains to say is, yeah, thank you very much for all of you for attending tonight's virtual meeting. As you know, the next scheduled meeting is on the 9th of November this year. So we will say good night for now, and we will meet again then. So can I wish everyone a good summer and hope that they are able to make the most of it and maybe even get some time away at some juncture.
Thank you, Councillor Vaughan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.